Today is Monday, November 29, 2010. My name is Mark DePuy, Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. I am here this morning with Senator Phil Rock. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
It's an overcast day. It looks like the clouds are coming in. We're sitting up in your office. Why don't you tell us exactly where we're at, Senator?
We are at 321 Clark Street. This is a rather famous or infamous now building. It was the home to a big corporation here in Illinois that suddenly moved, and now the American Bar Association has assumed the proprietary rights. They've rented 12 floors of the building, and right smack dab in the middle of the loop, right next to the river. It's quite a building.
Who was here before then?
It was the food company. It was
Quaker Oats?
Quaker Oats. The Quaker Oats. It was years it was called the Quaker Oats building. And used to have a lot of civic events here. And
kind of harkens back to Chicago's agricultural days, and you've just got the Chicago Board of Trade and Mercantile down the street here a bit. So.
Right.
Okay, well, we were here, though, not to talk about that, but to talk about Governor Jim Edgar and your association with him. Our first session we had, we talked about his years in Secretary of State's office while you were in the Senate. And we finished that session basically with him winning an election over Neil Hartigan in 1990, and he's going to become the governor of the state. And at the time, in November and December, there were lots of, I don't want to call them rumors, but information flying about the financial problems the state was in. But according to the governor, when he got to the office, he found out it was much more significant than he had originally thought, and he was looking at a $1 billion deficit. So I wonder if, let's start with this. Do you recall the first time you had a meeting with the governor-elect or the governor after he won that election?
yeah, I think the meeting was not held on a sour note or a dour note. I think everybody was kind of upbeat. The election was over. Everybody was breathing a little more easily, and I think pretty much we're and the governor included, were pretty much anxious to get going. That they recognized that perhaps they hadn't had all the relevant information that we needed, but let's get up and get going. And I think everybody had that spirit of enthusiasm at that time, at least.
Did he have an individual session with you, or was this with the legislature?
Yeah, we had a chance to talk individually, and he shared with us his view of the books and records and the financial condition of the state, the kind of information that he would have to give to the bonding authorities, for instance. He made available to us, and we were grateful for that. It gave everybody starting at the same starting line for a change, and I think that was a welcome thing. The news was not real happy, but if you look back and then compare it to what's happened recently, no comparison. We were talking about the possibility of a $1 billion deficit, and that would have been against probably a $30 billion budget all told when it's done. These days we're up at $50 billion budgets, and we're talking 8, 10, 12, 15 billion in deficit. It's absolutely inane what we're doing, what we have done to ourselves. So I think the spirit was upbeat. The governor indicated he was ready to do what it took. Everybody left that kind of undefined, but I think there was a resolve that when the meeting concluded, that we were all going to try to work together and get that part of the budget at least out, get it off our back.
Do you recall that if you gave him any initial guidance that first time you met?
The only initial guidance I gave him, I said, Jim, you're better off telling the truth. Not that you're not telling the truth. I don't mean to imply that, but all through this process, I said, share with these people. I said, they're your elected board of directors, even though you didn't pick them. This is what we've got, and a board of directors should know how the corporation is doing and why it's doing what it's doing, and only you have that information, and you ought to be prepared to treat the appropriations people and their committee chairs and vice chairs the same as you would the bonding authority. Sit them down and tell them what the facts are, and let them ramble a while. Let them loose, and we'll see what happens.
Why don't you, from your perspective at that time, tell us how a normal, maybe that's an interesting word to use here, a normal budgetary process should work to determine what the state's budget should be?
Well, it should work because we have built in certain steps along the way. We have, for instance, lapse period spending, which is a number that no one knows probably except the governor. That's the kind of information that should be made available. I hope today is made available to the General Assembly members so that everybody's working on the same wavelength. I mean, if you and I are studying a budget and there's 35 or 40 billion dollars unaccounted for in there, somebody's got to fess up as to who's got the right numbers. And I think the governor took our advice and was sharing a little more freely the information that the condition of the state financially. And it wasn't pretty, but it wasn't a death knell either. I mean, it was something that could be remedied. All we'd have to do is get to work and perhaps push a hard vote or two.
The originating budget, though, did that come from the governor's office, the governor's budget office, or did that come from the House?
No, the governor did have a good deal of input on it. Mechanically, as I recall, the House was putting it together and helping him present it, or perhaps giving him the slant that they wanted to present, while staying within the recognized boundaries.
Well, we've been focusing so far on the budget because that first year, that seemed to be the overwhelming task that he had to wrestle with, and everything else kind of flowed from that. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, I wonder if you can do a quick comparison for us, because you'd had 14 years of Jim Thompson, and now you've got a new governor and quite a different personality from most accounts. Similarities and differences between the two men and how they worked legislation?
Jim Thompson was much more aggressive. He would take the ball, even if the ball wasn't in his court. He would try to take the ball and move it upfield against the wishes of some in the House, particularly. And Jim was a little more reticent. He was not quite, and understandably, it was his first time. It's tough to compare the two because by this time Thompson had a great deal. At the end, he had an enormous amount of experience that's incalculable in terms of when you're finally dealing with these folks. I mean, he would call us together, the leadership together, over in the mansion and have his charts and graphs and pointers and everything else, and go right down the line. And any question he had, he'd answer it. And he had his director of the budget there, but really didn't even afford him the opportunity to say a great deal. It was kind of did a little welcome speech and said, boy, things are tough, we better get going here. And then they sat him down and Jim Thompson took over. It wasn't the same with Jim because Jim wasn't quite up to speed yet. He was in the same position kind of that the legislature was in. We were not up to speed either in terms of their sheer numbers. But it came around afterwards. Jim was, I think it's fair to say, he was open and willing and recognized that now he's elected for 4 years, so he can't, that he's got the authority to make these changes. And it was a question of his resolve that would make it happen, only his.
One of the huge issues in the campaign was whether or not to retain that income tax surcharge. Hardigan was in the position that they shouldn't retain it. Edgar was advocating that they should retain it, which was kind of reverse of the classical roles, Democrat versus Republican. Here's a Republican who's essentially arguing for the higher tax level. Did you think, because of that $1 billion deficit, that it needed to go higher than that there needed to be another revenue source?
No, I thought we could do it with the continuation of that surtax. I thought we could do it. And I was one who was in favor of it. I didn't say a great deal. I wasn't asked very often. My opinion, but I think both Neil and Jim knew my opinion, that this was politically, it was an easy way. If you just don't say anything, it's going to happen. You don't have to do anything affirmatively. It's just going to happen. And that makes a significant, there was a significant difference between starting over, to start from the ground zero and say we've got to have a tax increase, and for these reasons would not have sold as well as saying if we just leave things alone, this is going to be virtually resolved by itself. We don't have to do anything.
But aren't you making the assumption at that time that there's going to be a rebound in the economy, that you're going to have more revenue generated rather than have to make some fairly significant cuts up front?
Yes. That's a judgment call that we talked to the bond authorities, we talked to a lot of people, and we talked to our financial friends here in Illinois, and I think it's fair to say there was a difference of opinion. And you came down on the optimistic side or the not so optimistic side, the pessimistic side, and I was and am an optimist on this, and I think Jim was leaning that way, but he wasn't politically as sure of himself as with Thompson. There would have been no question at all, none. He just flew straight ahead.
Because Thompson was more of an optimistic type as well?
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple times about the bonding authority issue. How did that factor into this overall discussion about the budget?
Well, I think people were paying, for the first time, in my experience at least, that people were paying attention to the bond authorities. They did wield some unwieldy power there for a while that somebody was always asking, what's the opinion of the bond authorities, whether, what kind of interest rates are we going to be charged, and that kind of stuff. And Jim Thompson and I, as a matter of fact, traveled together to visit Wall Street and the bond authorities, and sat down with the analysts who were doing Illinois, and I think they were quite taken with the fact that there was a Democrat and a Republican both in the Assembly and now in front of them, talking openly and honestly about what we can do and what we should do. And I think it helped.
Was that in reference to the Build Illinois project that Thompson had at the end of his administration? I guess what I'm wrestling with here is, was there a serious thought given in 1991 about actually getting a bond to help balance the budget? I'm not knowledgeable enough about the finances, so.
Yeah, no, it wasn't that so much. It was just the holding down of the interest rates, that we wanted these authorities to know that we were serious about reducing the deficit. The deficit would be reduced, and how we do it, we're working on that. But I think it was just we wanted to convey to them the sense that, one, we were aware of the problem, two, we thought we had all the pieces, and now it was just a question of putting it together.
Okay. Do you remember any specific advice you gave the governor, other than what you've already mentioned about getting that budget balanced?
No, I think from that point on, we were just kind of handling the what I call routine bills, and there had been no bubbling up yet of any call for a tax increase or any call for a major cut in any way. We were just kind of playing the cards as they came.
How about the complications that are presented when you factor in the pension system into that equation?
Pension system has been a trouble. It will remain a troublesome spot for years to come, I'm afraid. And Jim was, I think, I don't want to speculate, but I think as a former staff guy and a staff director, he was well aware of the importance of the pension and the pension benefits for the members and for the officers. And he took it very seriously and did not want to ignore. And he was the one that called for the first time, a really ramp up approach and give the fund more money. The fund needs more money. I mean, contrast, for instance, you had a Dan Walker, who for the first time in the history of the state of Illinois was asking that a lesser amount be appropriated than was being paid out. Well, for God's sake, you're paying from a deficit position. How can you do that, Governor? And he did it. He proposed it. And a couple of the bills, I think we overrode one or two at least. But he was at a number that was significantly different than the actual number that was required for the payout. If you have 10 people on the payroll that are supposed to get $100 a month, you can't get by with appropriating 50. It just doesn't work. And
but when you've got a $1 billion deficit, that big a hole to fill, it's awfully tempting to defer or delay those payments, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an easy mark. And in those days, you recall, that was Jimmy Carter's years. The interest rates were at 20 and 22%. It was a real mess.
So a little bit easier in the 90s when the interest rates were way below that rate.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I want to quote Governor Edgar himself in some of his early discussions with you. And I'd have to say that he saw you as part of the friendly opposition, as somebody he could go to and sit down and talk with sincerely and work the issues out, even though that you were from opposing parties, so to speak. He says that Phil Rock got a hold of him one time and sat him down, and basically this is the quote. This is you saying to him, "You've been dealt a bad hand. It's not your fault. You've got to raise taxes." Is that in reference, you think, to that first budget battle?
Yeah.
And that's in reference to the surcharge, to retain the surcharge?
Yeah. Yeah.
Tell us about how then the strategy, once you get to that point of, now, he's gone in some detail to talk about those first few months, and realizing you had that budget deficit, and you walk it all the way through the middle of July, and he even misses a payroll in the process of that first budget fight. Paint us a picture, if you can, about the dynamics of the personalities involved. And I guess what I'm referring to here is what we always hear from the press is that it's the four tops, the four legislative leaders sitting down with the governor. And is that the case, and how did that actually work out?
Yeah, I think that was one of the first instances where at least in my experience, where the discussions between the four of us actually were producing some results. Jim was apparently willing to accept help, looking for help, and I think I certainly did, and I think the others did too, take it seriously, and we wanted to help, recognizing that a tax increase vote really doesn't help anybody. Some get madder than others, but even if you're right, you spend a great deal of time, it's almost like a distraction. Wherever you go, whatever you're saying, whatever your message is, people want to talk about the tax increase, necessary or unnecessary. But I think there was genuine goodwill among the four of us that recognized that something has to be done, and let's do the best we can under the circumstances.
Where were the meetings, and how often were these meetings between the leadership?
Well, that's kind of a difficult one to answer. They would start out. They started out in the Republican leader's office, House Republican leader's office.
Lee Daniels?
Yeah.
And the governor would come to that office?
That office, right.
And Joan Walters as well?
I'm sorry?
And was Joan Walters there as well?
Yes.
Did he have any other people with him?
No, as I recall, his staff guy was one of his staff people was in and out, but no staying power. He didn't. He was just kind of handling the day-to-day affairs. And then I offered my office, and I said, if you want my opinion, these meetings ought to be held in the governor's office, not in any legislative leader's office. Because what's going to happen, and it did happen, and it's happened since, is that there's almost a proprietary interest in the venue, my office or your office. If you don't come to my office, I'm not going to talk to you. And that happened. And so I had to, and I did, I had to visit with each of the other three and said, look, we're getting nowhere fast here because we're now down to nitty-gritty stuff like whose office do we meet in? What the hell difference does it make? But I said, you and I both know it's the TV cameras. There's 30 TV cameras and 12 reporters out there hawking us down the hall. So as soon as you walk into Daniel's office or as soon as you walk into Madigan's office or my office, the whole thing takes a little different flavor to it. And I said, we don't need that. We don't need it. I said, well, why don't you pass a law and make my office neutral? I said, that probably won't work, but be worth some fun for 2 days. But I said, we better get down to it and just recognize that the governor's a busy man. He's got people waiting to see him all day. One, it'll push us to move a little faster, I suspect, than just kind of visiting around in a social hour. And so from that point forward, I think we pretty much used only the governor's office when a meeting had to be called. And sometimes the meeting had to be called. Sometimes the governor said, oh, the hell with it, I want to talk to these guys today. And we'd have to have Daniels in particular call it, or Pate, and say, hey, we need a meeting, and block out some time. But once it got rolling, once the wheels started to turn, it took on a little different flavor. They could see, I think, the Republicans particularly could see that we were not there to be obstructionists. We were there trying to help. Mm-hmm. And it worked out all right.
Well, I wonder if you could lay out for us or explain why in Illinois then, and I think still to this day, you have the four legislative leaders who have such a dominance in what happens in legislation for the state. Why not the rank and file members of those two bodies?
Well, there's been an effort to bring the rank and file members aboard. If you remember the last few years at least, the committees and subcommittees of the Appropriations Committee were directly involved. They would zero in on the individual agencies and make some of those decisions, line item decisions as to what they ought to be doing. And that was at the direction of the leader. The leader would say, okay, we got to hold DCFS down beyond, they want a 10% increase, they can't have 10. Nobody else is getting 10, that kind of stuff. So there were decisions that were made. We were viewed as doing, frankly, the bigger picture. If we do this and this and this and this and this is what we come up with, we hope. And those last the last few tightenings of the nuts and bolts were left to the governor. It was, his ship of state that was going up or down, and I think, as Pete so aptly put it, sink or swim. Here we go, And Edgar was pretty good about it. He recognized that this was a chance to sew it up, nail it down, if you will. That he could walk onto the floor or into his caucus at least and say, the other three agree with this, and as long as we've got an agreement and we're satisfied, we ought to take it and run. And that's essentially what happened. We put together a budget that was. When you get through all the other stuff, the little bit of political infighting we had, I think the budget decisions were good ones.
Well, that first 2 years especially, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the Democrats had control of both the House and the Senate, correct?
Yes.
So you had the hand in that respect, and you got into the end of June time frame, and you still don't have a budget that you've settled on, and he gets into early July, and at least as Governor Edgar has explained it, the battle becomes one between, I shouldn't say battle, but the disagreement was primarily between Madigan and himself. Would that be a good characterization?
Yeah. And there were a number of issues that they were jousting about, and Pate and I just took ourselves out of the program for a couple of weeks. I'm not going to argue about that.
You remember what the specific issues were?
No, I really don't. I think it's fair to say that some of the issues were camouflage for what they really wanted, and what they really wanted was caps on the local expenditures. In other words, when the DuPage County Board met and wanted a 25% increase in their budget, we wanted something to say, no, too much. If you're going to go above 5%, I think it was 5, you have to have a public hearing, after this, you have to do that. But it was a definite restriction against local government. And by the time local governments woke up to the fact that this was being foisted upon them, it was almost too late. It was too late. Jim had virtually signed it by that time. And we made the usual political speeches, good ones, I thought, that we'd be back in a year or 2 years or 3 years redoing this. I said, you cannot expect people to run for local office and then take any authority away from them. That doesn't make any sense. You put a mechanic in there, put a staff person in there, but this is an elected official. If they want to raise their taxes 25%, let them go out and get the votes. Why is that your business? All of a sudden we're like going to be like the big mother hen. We're going to make all the decisions. And I said, it's simply not going to work. Mm-hmm. And to this day, it hasn't been completely abolished, but it's been chewed away so that you wouldn't recognize it. I mean, the call for the 5% increase is virtually dead. I don't know anybody who does it. I think they perfunctorily put the ad in the paper saying certain items in the budget may exceed the statutory authorization. Well, who knows? Nobody knows what that means anyway.
Well, the governor made some pretty significant cuts in staffing, limiting the size of the state government, actually making some cuts and not just limiting growth, as I recall. And there was compromises on both sides, but he came away from that, and his assessment was he won that first budget battle. Is that how you would assess it as well?
Yeah, I think that's fair. He did win. Because one of the things that was a reality, and he knew it, everybody in the building knew it, is that the division in the Senate was very close. There was no monolith in the Senate. The House was a little different. If Mike had 7 or 8 spare votes, you can push people around a little bit. But in the Senate, it simply wasn't that way. And I had some people in my caucus that were recalcitrants. They just they didn't want to vote for anything, for any reason, good or bad. They just they wanted their opinions to have some sway. They wanted to have people pay attention to them, but they didn't want to get in the mainstream. They didn't want to get in the swing of things.
Well, Senator, you're willing to share some names or portions of the state, parts of the caucus?
I think it's fair to say that the Chicago delegation, which was the largest, had some members that, one, they personally didn't like the governor, and two, they didn't like much of what he said. And so they just kind of threw up their hands and walked away from it. Offered no help. But there were enough of us, hopefully, to overcome that. But we lost a couple of those battles. We lost that battle on the caps on the interest rates. That should never have become the law. I mean, it's not good for anybody, except the die-hard anti-tax people, the Jim Tobins of the world. They want no taxes, or if you're going to have a tax, make it as little as possible and lock it in, keep it there forever. Well, you can't run a government that way. You can't run a business or a house that way.
Tell us a little bit more about the nature of your caucus, because I've always been intrigued by, you mentioned already you've got the Chicago portion of it, but then you've got the downstate Democrats as well.
Yeah, we had, if you recall, a group called the Crazy Eight that were 8 or 9 individuals from outside metropolitan Chicago who resented the fact that they were identified as daily Democrats, or in my opinion, a couple of them didn't even like to be called Democrats. I don't know what the hell they wanted to be called, but they didn't. But they were quite sincere. They would get up early in the morning and go over to Bill's, like I did with my staff. I would be in one office with my staff going over to Bill's and the calendar for that day, and they'd be in a room down the hall doing the same thing, different results, frankly, on some of this stuff. But on any given day, I might have 30 bodies that I could count, but I couldn't count on 30 votes. I mean, it never happened in my tenure as the leader.
When you say 30 out of 57?
30 is the constitutional majority that's needed. Now, if you look back in the Blue Book, I can't give you the numbers off the top of my head, but I never got up as high as 35. I think one year I got to 32. Maybe one year I got to 33. But even with 32 and 33, I was never sure of 30. That's the way it was.
Who was the leader of the Crazy Eights, or was there a leader?
Well, that was one of the problems they had, that everybody was a leader. It was a headless horseman. They were all over the place. Terry Bruce was one. Don Wooten was another. He was from Rock Island. Terry was from Carbondale and South and Point South.
Well, I know there was at least one Chicago Democrat on that list. That was Dawn Clark Netsch.
That was Dawn Netsch.
But then she would have been controller at this time, wouldn't she? Yeah, she was not in the legislature
She was
at that
not
time.
there at that time. Right?
Okay. Tell us about the other leaders, the four tops then. You have yourself, and then you have James Pate Phillip. You haven't mentioned much about him, but in terms of the budget battles, how did he come down on the discussions? How did his personality manifest itself?
He tolerated, is I think the word, the meetings and the discussions. Didn't like it. Would have preferred not to do it, not to participate. Because a couple of times he stopped in my office and said, "Why the hell don't we forget this today?" I said, "Pete, if we forget it today, that means tomorrow somebody else is going to say, let's skip it today." And I said, "This thing will never happen." I said, "At least give the guy a chance to make his case." I said, I don't agree with this stuff. And so Pate was building up a head of steam. He was starting to listen to the Jim Tobins of the world that cut them all off. They get nothing. I said, "Nothing? What? You're going to go back to DuPage County and tell the DuPage County board, the biggest board next to Cook in the state, that you can't have a 5% increase without a hearing?" I said, "Come on, give me a break."
And that's his power base.
Yeah. Well, and so to that extent, that cuts both ways. He had a lot of friends and neighbors on the county board that he could push around, and they would listen. And in county government throughout the county, he had a lot to say. But he was not very patient in that setting. He was like, "Come on, let's get going here. Let's get going." And of course, that's not the way those meetings ran. You'd have to hear from Daniels, and then Daniels would be refuted by Madigan, and then Madigan would be refuted by Pate to say, "Yeah, the hell with it," And they'd get around to me, and I'd try to start over and get this thing moving. There was a real dynamic that was going on all the time, and I would say, and Pate is my friend and will forever be my friend, because we used to sneak out the back door. All the press was always in the front, like in the rotunda, with the cameras and the pencils and the whole thing. And the four of us would come marching out or come marching out. And the press would go over there to see Madigan, and over here to see Daniels, and over here to see Pate. Where's Pate? Pate's gone. Pate went out the back door, and I went with him. I said, "At least we're going to make it look like a House-Senate fight. We're not going to, I said, "This is nuts." But we would slip out the back, and right near the governor's back door, out of his office, you head right out to the corridor, the stairwell. So it was a very quick trip. Boom, and you're up in the impregnable third floor where they couldn't get near Pate's office. They'd catch me in the hallway sometimes, and I said, "Senator Phillip and I decided that the Senate wasn't needed at this point in the discussion, so we'll attend the next one. Maybe."
What was the relationship between Phillip and the governor that you saw just in these meetings, for example?
Yeah, I think Pate was one who thought more politically than the others, obviously. He's a politician, and a good one, the county chairman, and he's got all kinds of responsibilities. And I think he viewed Edgar in that way. And Edgar was not as tough a politician as Pate would have wanted. I mean, Pate would have liked some guy with a hammer and an axe in there, just chop the budget apart and hammer anybody down who disagrees. He didn't have that. He had a more genteel approach to the whole business. And so I don't think they ever got very close. No, I could be wrong. That's just a perception of mine that they were not exactly buddy politically, at least. Personally, that's another story, but politically they were not.
how about on the House side? And let's start with Madigan, because most people, the talking heads at least, would say that Mike Madigan was then, and still to this day, at least the second most powerful man in Illinois state government, if not sometimes the most powerful.
Yeah, Mike is like the Sphinx. He sits and listens and looks and never changes expression, and you don't quite know where he's coming from. I never had any problem at all with Mike Madigan. We got along very well. And he was open and freewheeling with me and as to what he thought ought to be done, when it ought to be done. So we got along all right. He did not at all get along with Lee. They were at each other's throats for quite a while.
Being Madigan didn't get along with Lee.
I'm sorry?
You're saying Madigan didn't get along with Lee?
Correct.
Okay.
And I don't think he had a very high regard for Jim Edgar. I think because again, Mike thinks in political terms. What's good politically? What's not good politically? Edgar wasn't quite there yet in terms of that kind of thinking. Not that it's bad; it's just a different approach, and. So I think Mike, to that extent, Mike kind of wrote him off. He didn't take what he said very seriously.
Well, did that change? Did Madigan's opinion change after that first budget battle, and where Edgar at least feels like he won, and when he's feeling like he won, he beat Madigan in the process.
Right, and I think that's a fair assessment. I think Mike would admit that we got beat, and we got beat again for a whole number of reasons, not the least of which was I didn't have 30 votes. I think Mike could have put as many as he wanted on the board, but I couldn't deliver.
Did Madigan then have greater respect for Edgar coming out of that battle?
I don't know that his opinion changed very much. I think it just kind of corroborated what he had thought originally. It was his first real encounter with him. And subsequent encounters were a little bit different. He was a little friendlier, I think is a good... He was warming up a little bit toward Jim. And because his last couple of meetings we had, he was in there with both feet, fighting for what he wanted.
Wanted to take another quote. Again, talking to Governor Edgar, we've gone over this material quite a bit. And here's another quote that he said that you had mentioned to him. People say, "What is the best advice you ever got?" Again, this is Edgar saying. I say, it's Phil Rock telling me, chill out. I never did chill out till the second term, but I just remember him saying, and later I thought, here he is, he just wanted to go home, and here's this freshman governor who's made his life miserable, and he's arguing over $300,000 in a $27 or $24 billion budget. I'm sure Rock was just furious with me at that point. Now, where in this particular process it was, but he remembers that story and that advice you gave me. Do you?
Yeah. I did get a little bit mad at him and tell him to chill out. I said, you're gonna have to grow up in this job. You got more fish to fry than this little stinking bill. And I genuinely liked him, still like him. He just he came at it. He came at that office from a different background. There's a hell of a difference between being a staff guy, even a head staff guy, and being the guy. And,
well, I mean, you could make the point that all governors come at it from a different perspective. Certainly Walker did. Jim Thompson came from a completely different background, and who other than Edgar had more depth of experience in both legislative affairs and in a constitutional office and working in state government,
Right.
being with Arrington.
Right. And I think part of it was, Jim, that people started with that assumption that here's a guy that all the experience in the world that you could have, and he still does not get it right. You know, they just thought it's not clicked in.
When you say he wasn't getting it right, it didn't click in. What exactly are you referring to, though?
The political side of virtually every question that we deal with. Like it or not, there is a political side to virtually everything we do down there. And one, it has to be recognized, and two, it has to be dealt with. You can't ignore it. I always said one of my dreams is that I'd go back there with 35 senators, all of whom I elected or helped elect. And I would rise up on the first day and say, "Here's the agenda, folks. We're going to be busy for 2 weeks." Yeah, it's a great.
But it
dream.
wouldn't last for month after month. It would just last 2 weeks. Huh?
That's all. That's all I'd need to set the whole calendar for 2 months.
Well, we left one person out of this Four Tops discussion. We've mentioned him a couple times, but Lee Daniels and the relationship between Daniels and Edgar, and in this group in particular, once the Four Tops were together. What role did he play?
He's always well informed and pretty well had his mind made up. You got the impression that my way or no way. And, you know, that's one way to bargain. And sometimes he won and sometimes he didn't. But I think he always envisioned himself as the governor, or should be the governor. They keep, all these other guys keep coming through, and Daniels is still there in the House. Not a small job, the Speaker of the House, but I think he had a higher ambition. And unfortunately, never got a chance to try it out. Because he was more contentious than the rest. Even though Pate was a little harder nosed, Pate would make a big deal out of it. I mean, he'd tell you you're wrong, and that's it. He's out. He's gone. Daniels would sit and argue and point out 30 different ways you're wrong. And some took it well, some didn't take it at all. And I don't think Lee took it very well.
Well, the
I mean,
four very different people in that group, and five when you throw Edgar in, certainly. Was there one of those, was Philip or was Daniels there representing the agenda of the governor? Or did each one have their own specific agenda that they were pursuing?
I would say that Pate wanted to be with the governor. That was his disposition. That's the way he saw his role as the Republican leader. Daniels seldom was with him. Daniels would always have a better way to do it, or his way would reflect what the people want.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Edgar was just biding his time, because it's like walking through a landmine field. You don't quite know where your foot's going to get blown off.
In other words, you're not sure exactly who your friends are in this.
That's correct. That's correct.
What role did you see yourself playing in that group?
Oh, kind of a go-between. Daniels might not talk to Pate, but he would talk to me, and Pate would talk to me, and then I'd talk to them and have them talk to each other. I mean, it got a little convoluted, but things got hot and heavy down there. You know, when it gets to be about the 1st of July, and you say, what the hell are we doing here? We're 30 days, at least 30 days over and we're nickel and diming around here, so the proposals started to get a little more reasonable, and when they got a little more reasonable, I would step in a little bit more and put a little pressure on these guys to get it over with. I said, you got the city of Chicago to contend with. I said, now you can't possibly make this applicable to the city of Chicago under anybody's thought. I said, you'll have to veto it yourself. I said, Chicago's got to be excluded from this. I said, you want to do it to your county?
Again, you're talking about the tax cap?
Yeah, the tax cap.
And
that was a big deal. And the local governments, unfortunately, they weren't paying attention to that 30 days in July when we were arguing the hell out of this thing, and all of a sudden, boom, for their next board meeting where they're proposing the budget, they have to have less than 5%, or they need a public hearing. Oh, man. We weren't 2 days out, and they started calling for a special session to repeal that son of a gun.
Well, of course, I think it was the 18th of July that the budget was finally passed, so
right.
They missed the payroll for some of the state employees by a couple days. And
right.
I know that was a great concern of the governor himself, to think there was state employees out there who were going to miss that payroll and go through that financial strain. But he got the thing passed, and from your assessment, certainly from his assessment, it was a victory on his side. And then the economy stubbornly did not improve. And they got to December and January and says, holy cow, we got a bigger hole even than we thought. And you guys had to go back at it again. Do you remember anything particular about going back and tinkering with that? This would have been the 1992 budget?
Not specifically. I can remember tinkering, but I don't remember much specific.
Okay.
It was kind of like every time we walked in, we said, so we told you so. Everybody was taking credit for the fact that they knew the answer then, but they weren't going to tell anybody about it.
It's a lot of second guessing in that respect.
Yeah.
I don't know if you recall anything about the reapportionment fight that would have occurred. Would that have been 92 that went on?
Yeah, every 10 years. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not sure of the date. I think so.
Do you recall anything specific about that reapportionment? Because that's, the inside politics, that's where, future majorities are made, if you want to look at it that way. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. But
no, I'm just trying to, I just don't recall. Was that when Ryan was the governor then, right? I was with one map with Ryan anyway.
Yeah, well, that would have been 2002. Is that?
Okay.
That would have been the end of Ryan's administration. Okay, if you don't mind, let's shift gears here. And I wanted to ask just your impressions of some of the other people that Edgar had on his team.
Okay, then I got to move on.
Okay. Very quickly then, let's start with the Chief of Staff, Kirk Dillard.
Kirk Dillard was probably one of the best staff guys I ever saw operate. Very studious, politically very aware, and a straight shooter. He was good.
Joan Walters, his budget director.
Yeah, I think she was certainly competent. She knew the material. Didn't deliver very well. I mean, in terms of her own public speaking ability. And she was very soft-spoken and never got overly excited. And I think she was just out of her league. She should have been with a corporate board as opposed to this jungle that we were in. But she was fine. Nobody liked to directly argue with her. You felt like a bully, you know. So the hard questions, she would come into a meeting, she would have somebody with her who could answer the direct slurs and stuff.
Mike Lawrence, the press secretary.
Well, Mike, again, was probably too knowledgeable. He knew more about the business than most people in the room. And he had a set of rules and regulations that he lived by, and he expected everybody else to live by them. And he was a good commentator on things political in the Capitol building, highly regarded, and most people didn't want to cross swords with him because they knew they were going to lose. He's got the newsprint.
Mm-hmm. Well, he also had the ear of the governor, because most would say that you couldn't find a closer advisor to the governor than Mike Lawrence.
Right. He was the last word for the governor. Yes.
The legislative liaisons, and I believe at that time frame when you were still there, would have been Steve Selke and Mark Bozell.
Yeah, both very good. Very good mechanic. I like to call them good mechanics. I had a couple. I had Bill Holland, who's distinguished himself as the auditor. And those people are irreplaceable. They're that good that they're the kind of people you want to see around as kind of a career diplomat, a career staff person is a good thing. And the problem we have is that all those kids are able, youngsters are able, younger people are able, and they're quickly recruited, either by the corporate world for lobby business or analysis or whatever. But they can't do without them.
Are there anybody else in Edgar's inner team, if you will, that sticks out to you?
No, not really.
Your impressions of Mrs. Edgar, then, Brenda Edgar?
Delightful lady, just delightful. You're never sure with ladies, having met as many as I have over the years. In the position of leader, I try to greet everybody and get to know everybody, and there aren't too many women that like politics. And she did remarkably well under some terrible circumstances. When they were beating up on him pretty good, she was gracious as could be. Nice person.
Well, you've indicated that you're needing to get going here pretty soon.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about the second budget fight. Anything in particular?
No, I don't think there was anything spectacular about that one.
Different results for the governor. He figures that he lost that round in the summer of 1992. He didn't fare quite as well, but he still felt awfully good about having prevailed in the July of 1991 on that.
Yeah.
Let's kind of do some summing up then. Your overall assessment of the Edgar, well, first of all, your retirement from public life. Let's talk about that just a bit, that decision.
Well, at that point in my life, I was ruminating about the possibility of running for the Illinois Supreme Court. As a lawyer, that's a pinnacle for those of us that have a law degree. And I went so far, as a matter of fact, to have petitions printed, and I had some of them signed. I was walking around with them in my pocket, and I went to see some people, political people, obviously, up my way, so I wouldn't. So I'd have home base protected, so I wouldn't have to stay there and man the walls. I could go out go get them. And I wound up one night sitting at the kitchen table. It was about 11:30 at night, and I was going over these petition sheets that I had spent all day and all night wrestling up. And I thought, what the hell am I doing? You know, this is... So I rethought the position and thought, well, it's about time I spent a little time with the family and see if I can regenerate my law business and make a living for a change. So I just I called some of the people that I had called to go the other way, and I said, I appreciate your encouragement and your enthusiasm and your help, but I just don't think I'm going to make the run. I've been in government 25 years, and that's enough for any sane person. And I said, I've still got a long time remaining. My kids are not quite fully grown, so they're still around. And so I just opted out. And the fact is, the one that was waiting at the door and was for a lot of reasons expectant to receive the endorsement of our party was Mary Ann McMorrow, as the first woman justice in our state's history. Delightful person, a good lady, good politician. But she told the powers that be, and even the ones that supported her, that she would not run if I was running. She and I were close friends, I think, I knew her politically. But for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I was liberated. I just had nothing to do. And so I got a young man who has political ambition, has the will and the knowledge to do it, and I installed him politically as the committeeman and said, go get him.
Who was that?
Don Harmon. He's doing very well, as I suspected he would, as I knew he would.
So essentially, the 1992 election, you bowed out at that time?
Yes.
And who won the seat after you left?
After I left. Well, we lost the Senate, and Pate was the Senate president. And then we got it back.
But not the presidency, but your particular representative district.
Oh, I see, okay. Well, there was a map change subsequent to that. But so Don Harmon is filling my he's got probably 80% of my old district.
Okay. Well, let's get to some concluding questions here then for you.
Okay.
And start with an overall assessment of the Edgar administration. And not just the time frame that you were serving in the legislature, but the overall 8 years that he had.
No, I think fairly one would have to admit that he was a good governor, conscientious, government wise, and a hard worker. Yeah, I would give him high marks as a governor.
One in particular, in terms of the accomplishments or the legislation or things that happened during his administration, would you point to say, yes, he was a good governor?
Oh, gosh. No, I'd have to look at a list. If you give me a list of 5 things, I could say that was a good one.
Well, balancing the budget would be one. One that he didn't expect, but governors oftentimes get, the flood of 1993. Educational reform, break that up into 2 parts, Chicago school reform and finding a way to generate more revenue for his schools in general.
Yeah.
And also what he did in terms of adoption and child welfare. Those would be 5 that I would list off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay. And I think the education piece is could be his hallmark. I think that was both Chicago and downstate. I happen to have been there during that period of time. I know how hard he worked and how hard a lot of people worked to get that done. And hopefully it's starting to pay dividends with some of the recent test scores and the vindication, I think, of some of the naysayers' doubts about whether or not it could be done at all, ever. I think he can take credit for an awful lot of that, if not all of it.
Would there be anything in particular you'd point to and say, here is a failure, or here is something I was disappointed about in terms of the administration?
No, I suppose, the tax caps just bugged me as a government lover. I'll never understand that, but that was a knee-jerk reaction to some concern by the anti-tax folks, and not just the anti-tax up to 5%, the anti-tax period. They don't want anything. And when you start talking in those terms, they lose their credibility. They've got nothing to say, in my opinion.
How about the MSI scandal? Do you think that hurt Edgar? Do you think there is anything to that?
No. I do not. And I would be shocked and surprised that Jim Edgar had any involvement. I don't believe it.
Looking back now, it's been a long time, almost 20 years since you stepped out of the public arena. Any regrets that you left that early in your life?
No, I have no regrets. When I did it full tilt, full bore, and loved it. And to a certain extent, it took away from another part of my life, namely my wife and kids. I just didn't see nearly enough of them. And then they started going off to school, and I saw them less. And that if I have any regret, that's it.
Well, Senator, I told you that I would keep this very focused on Jim Edgar, and I think we certainly have up to this point, but I'm awfully tempted to get your impression, just maybe a real quick impression of the governors who have followed Jim Edgar.
The governors who have followed. Okay. Tell me who they are, and I'll tell you what I think.
Well, first of all, we got George Ryan.
George was my friend and is my friend, and I think he was betrayed by others who called themselves his friends, and they weren't his friends, and I'm sick about it. Because if you look at what he ultimately was charged with, it's wrong. That he should bear the weight of those charges. It's just wrong.
Well, the next one.
And I think governmentally he was a good politician, a very good politician, and wanted to do what was best in the best interest of the state. I really believe that.
Do you think he was, I'm going to use this word, more skillful in dealing with the legislative leaders?
Yes. He was hail fellow, well met. He got along with everybody, and it wasn't a fall guy for everybody. He was almost too loyal to some of his friends who thought they were his friends, who pretended to be his friends, and all the time they were looking to take advantage of him, and they did.
Well, you're very much on the outside of the next personality, but I'm sure you hear from lots of people who are still friends in the House or to the Senate about Rod Blagojevich as governor.
I can honestly say I met the young man only once when he was a member of the Illinois House. He was one of the Chicago delegation that I love to talk about. There's a whole bunch of them from Chicago that as soon as they hit Springfield, whether they get off an airplane or get off a bus or get out of their car, the first thing they ask you when they see a leader, when are we going home? Now, they haven't been there 10 minutes, and they want to know when they're going home. And I used to keep tabs on some of these guys. It was always the ones that wanted to go home right away. I can name 5 or 6 that accomplished nothing. And every once in a while they'll vote awry. They'll know, for instance, that Madigan's got 75 votes on something, and they're all aye votes. These guys will vote no, just because they want to be recognized. Hey, we're still here, you know. They don't talk to, you know. Why do you talk to somebody who says, when are we going home? They don't want to be there. And I discouraged guys from running over the course of my career when they said, well, how much time do we have to spend? And that kind of, ooh, you're in the wrong business. Don't do it. So the long and short is, George is my friend and will remain my friend, and I wish him nothing but the best. He got a raw deal.
And Rod Blagojevich would not fall in that category.
No, I started with that. I met him only once when he ran up to me and asked me that question, how long are we going to be here? He was never in his seat in the House. Not that I ever looked for him, but just that was reported to me. He never sat in his seat.
Well, how about the next one? Is it fair to ask you about your opinions of Pat Quinn as governor, or is it too early to say that?
Yeah, it's too early. And I was shocked and appalled, however, to listen to the debate between our 2 gubernatorial candidates. A debate in which they each said nothing. Nothing. What are you going to do, Governor? Nothing. We're going to have to cut the deficit. Well, that's wonderful. How are you going to do that? Well, we'll cut spending. Well, that's good. Where are you going to cut spending? Well, we're going to cut the deficit. Okay. It'd be a wonderful study that somebody like Bruce Dumont, or one of those aficionados for the TV industry, would say, how'd you like to put these 2 guys on TV and have them explain what government is? Holy crap. So no, I have absolute nothing but disregard for that young man. I think he's twisted, and from what I hear, and again, this is hearsay, that he was one of 4 freshmen in the Congress of the United States who got clustered together. They sat together, these 4, each of whom had come from an elected position in other parts of the country, and they were plotting their move to be the vice president and president of the United States, and that's what they were working on. These 4.
Now you're talking about Blagojevich again.
Yeah, he's one of the 4. And that he was gearing up to be the vice presidential candidate. Go figure, you know. I don't know.
Well, I very much enjoyed talking to you. It's been illuminating. Anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, I wish Jim well, and I thank him for his service to our state. It was well done.
I think that's a fitting way to end. Thank you very much, Senator.
You are welcome. Say hello for me when you see him.
I will do that.